It's unfortunately another disappointing day of the Australian under-20 Young Socceroos campaign at the World Cup. Australia is officially eliminated. That come courtesy of a 1-1 draw between Nigeria and Colombia this morning. I'm not. I know you were working today, so I'm not sure if you saw it live or anything. But I was watching this game, and Nigeria hit the woodwork like 3 times, whilst Colombia were 1-0 up, and it was a bit of an open game going down the other end. And I'm thinking to myself, this is going to be an all-time blessing given to Australia if a few inches on 3 different occasions is what keeps them in the tournament. But it wasn't to be. A late penalty drew Nigeria level. And it means that Australia go home. They did beat Cuba. They got the 3-1 win. The goal against conceded in really disastrous fashion. But it turns out it wouldn't have mattered in the end. And I guess we had a brief conversation last week about this, but there is a little bit of conflict in terms of how you react to this performance from the Young Socceroos. Because on one hand, they have extraordinary expectations of themselves and the public have of them in terms of what they could have gone on to achieve at this tournament. But then also the luck of drawing against Italy and Argentina in the first few games really puts you on the back foot. And it's a hard line to toe in the middle of those two sides of the coin.
The reality of what it is that we're facing, I think, is somewhere in between, right? This is both a group that was extremely sort of unlucky with the circumstances surrounding them. And I don't just say that in the sense of like the natural draw and having to face Italy and Argentina, but I talk about it from even the way that us being fifth in the ranking of that table means we are the 17th of 16 teams to go through. But it's more like a lot of small things to kind of get that situation to work out also didn't go our way. You look at Group A, right? If New Zealand kept the negative 3 goal difference that they had off the back of their loss to Japan, they'd have kind of sat into third at the time. And obviously 3 points doesn't matter, but just at the time it could have mattered, right? So Egypt scored the 96th minute goal against Chile. And it's like, okay, well now it's -2 instead of -3 as a target that we've got to jump. Then you go to Group B and Group C. Group B, 1-1 South Korea, Panama throughout most of that game. Come into the 60th, 70th minute, South Korea have scored. Okay, there's another thing that goes against us. Group C, literally the entire final day of that group. We had Brazil and Spain at a loggerheads with each other. Brazil, in the first 15, 20 minutes, absolutely dominated, somehow didn't manage to get a goal. Spain have their one lucky moment in about the 64th or 65th minute, and then it's just like Brazil have absolutely nothing. You know, they're besides themselves, playing really poorly, rushing their passes. You know, players are getting a bit aggressive, and it's just like, okay, there's another thing that's gone against them. And then, you know, across the group, Mexico were only on 2 points. So if Morocco got ahead at 0-0, then they still would have been thrusted down to 2 points. And it's like, okay, here's another lifeline for the Young Socceroos. And then Mexico score, and then that's taken away. And this is just the first 3 groups. Obviously, then we came up to play. We take our 3-0 lead. We're looking pretty good. Things are feeling pretty confident. And then, of course, the Cuba moment. You know, Stephen Hall's really not done that well to sort of make his body big and capture that one. And then we come down to, exactly as you said, Colombia 1-0 this morning. And it's just not panned out with even a lot of the luck that was going their way. Yeah. Nigeria are obviously really not at their best throughout the tournament in terms of the accuracy and the way that they've been dominant on games, but not been able to put the whole thing together. And I guess I reflect on all of that now because I come back to something that does really hit me. When I look at all of these groups, A through F, I think outside of obviously Group C, where we would have had to face Morocco, Mexico, Brazil and Spain, this was obviously the toughest situation that we could have possibly been in. And I look at the fact that we've had an AFC team in Japan totally smoke that group with Chile and Egypt and New Zealand, who were all pretty bad. And then, I look at South Korea. South Korea were miserable in their own right, but they've had that game against Panama where, Panama, again, one of the weakest teams at the tournament, they're able to go through with 4 points because of it. And I just look at this and I think the Young Socceroos would have actually made a far better showing of that. Even Saudi, Saudi held their own against Norway, and Nigeria, but still they lost against Nigeria, who, as we were just saying, were a bit of a flimsy team, and Norway certainly made their fair share of mistakes throughout the tournament, right? Norway have hardly been that strong. And I just look at it and I think if you take away Saudi and South Korea in those situations, put the Young Socceroos in them, this is a team that's comfortably in the round of 16, if not the quarterfinals, depending on how their draw goes. So I look at it and I'm willing to be, quite defendant of the causation of the situation that we're in. But the reality of the situation is you can only play the opponents in front of you. And in that respect, this team, with the mentality that they've had, they've really let themselves down, and they've really let down the potential that we know this team has. Because, yeah, sure, we might actually be one of the top 8 teams at the tournament. Okay, we might have actually been comfortable enough to win a round of 16 game, have another group. But it's for that exact reason where if we're in an easier group and we make it through, we know we have the talent. And then let's say we're in a quarterfinal and we play Argentina and they put 4 past us and it plays out the same way. In that sense, then we're just going to be sitting here having the same conversation. So it's that verdict. And that for me is where I'm actually quite happy to settle on this and be quite happy in saying that much more needs to be done to address the golfing class between us and a few nations who are really established in being able to produce U20 talent like it's nothing. Go back to the pre-tournament preview where I said that I am curious about a lot of this squad because they play in Argentina and Argentina's league is in a state. That was so naive of me because obviously a country like Argentina, where kids eat footballs for breakfast, of course they're going to be really, really good. And of course they were.
Yeah.
So good that they've actually topped the group with 9 points, right? So that was very naive of me to go into it and to dare look at it that way, just because they were our opponent. It was very, very stupid, right? And it ultimately is that golfing class and that natural ability that these countries have that we've failed to live up to, where if this is the very, very best a U20 program out of Australia is going to do, then it's going to really set a lesson for the future of actually really neating self-belief that goes beyond playing assertive and playing that brave style of football that Trevor Morgan was so certain was going to be a winning formula for us, because it turns out the buck stops somewhere. Again, I go back to the fact that they got back in camp in Valparaiso and they were content with the fact that Italy game went quite well. The interviews were all in a positive tone. The language was in a positive tone. They went to training and it was mostly, we should actually be really proud of what we just did. And what was the end result? The end result was going into game 2, being complacent as all hell and getting completely outclassed by a team far, far technically better than us. So in that sense, let's get the pitchforks out and be pretty critical of what played out. And again, I say that of whether it was match day 2 or whether it was a quarterfinal, we still would have realistically seen the same version of the Young Socceroos, and that is the problem.
I find it interesting because so often Australia adopts this kind of underdog tag with a level of comfort. And I think that's where the reaction to the Italy game comes from. It comes from a place of, actually, we weren't supposed to beat them. So then it's okay when we don't, but we have a good performance. And it's a feeling of comfort that I think we have to get used to stepping outside of if you really want to improve and have success at these tournaments. And it depends on the characters in the squad and probably the age personality as well. Like obviously a certain amount of life experience gives you a different vantage of things compared to say the senior team as well. But Italy was really the missed opportunity. When we're looking back at this tournament, yes, Argentina were absolutely a class above, and Cuba we should have always beaten, and we did, even though we gave up that silly goal at the end. It's really that Italy game, and almost as much as it's good, and in a tournament setting you have to be positive because you have to think about the next game and you have to move forwards. But looking back at that Italy game and the reaction to it, almost with a sense of foolishness that we actually should have been a lot more disappointed than what we were.
Yeah, and I think again, if we go back to, I think a lot of the natural lessons that we've learnt, as a footballing country over time, right? When most people left the round of 16 in 06, regardless of obviously the controversy that surrounded that game, I think most people really, instead of talking about the fact that that's our best team ever, we made the knockouts at a World Cup, it's not going to get better than that. Most of the people should have looked at the fact that the other quarterfinal sort of, winner from the round of 16 was from a game known as the most boring knockout game in World Cup history between Switzerland and Ukraine. And I say this in the sense that, like, the golden generation probably could have made the semi-finals of the 2006 World Cup, but for the fact we faced Italy. And ever since that moment, ever since around how we've built as a nation, the shortcomings of the domestic structure, the shortcomings of our talent who go overseas to be able to become something of themselves. I feel that we've always been plagued by always getting to that scenario of where Australia does win and when Australia does success, we never look towards what comes next. In 2022, even though we were far, far beyond what any of us could have imagined by getting to that round of 16 game, there were some really silly mistakes in that game that played Argentina through. Everyone remembers the Grand Qual moment, and they talk about, it's so good that we got so close to Argentina, it's some sort of achievement. It's not an achievement. So again, why do we constantly tell ourselves that actually just being a knockout team is the bar? Just because we've never crossed it before. And you mentioned Ange Postecoglou and his whole nature. And obviously, look, it's not going so well at Nottingham Forest. This is probably the wrong time to have the conversation. The fact of the matter is he has come out multiple times in the book, in interviews, all of this time in his life. And he said that he went to 2014 with that group, similar enough to Italy and Argentina, with the Netherlands in it, with Spain in it, with Chile in it on South American soil. And he said, I can take this team to the World Cup and we can win. Now, is that probably the only time that that's ever truly happened in our history? I would almost say yes. And I think what really got me so excited about the Asian Cup that we won was it felt that Trevor Morgan actually really embraced that. He saw the state that our youth teams were playing in. He saw this negative, safe football that was instilled in us, and he wanted to change it. But the problem is he's gone in with that approach on the continental stage, won us some silverware, and then I really believe he's not maybe given up on that value, but he's thought that to the extent that that actually was displayed against Italy for half an hour or so, he's taken that and he's given himself a big tick mark and said, okay, we've just shown against that caliber of opponent that we can do it. But again, you ask someone who's more critical, you ask someone who's thinking more clearly about this. Did that Italy game actually go really, really well from point A to point B to point C? Most people would argue in the second half we were actually quite rubbish. And it's because of that mentality of rewarding the fact that we played really well, even after conceding, that we've then gone into the second half, gone into a rubbish second half where we've performed. They've gone into camp, and it's been like, this was really good, we're at that level. We can be at the level with Italy. So maybe, going into Argentina, we don't need to change up a whole lot. And that's just such a mistake. That the mentality there is so complacent. And it's so, I just feel, it really surmises what the Australian mentality is all about. That complacency and areas where that complacency comes in.
And I think like the two goals that we conceded, the first goal in the Italy game and the first goal in the Argentina game, obviously there was the penalty, but the lead up to the penalty, they were both like splitting through balls that cut through the team in the early stages of the game. Is that not being quite switched on? Maybe there was a slight tactical thing in the Italy game, I think, where the fact that they were playing a three at the back with wide backs, and I think we were playing a flat 4-4-2 at the time, and I thought the wide midfielders were actually pretty high and aggressive and allowed the wing backs to get the ball in space, and that was the guy who played the ball in behind Esposito. But a big pass that should never get through, and can you just be alert to just stop it and do the thing that you do 9 times out of 10 and block a pass like that in the first 10 minutes of a big game and have the wherewithal in your head and the presence of mind to just be able to do that. And, going into the second game, as you say, coming off Italy and thinking, yeah, maybe we don't have to change too much. Well, you didn't change anything and the exact same thing happened. That's how this works, right? And it was a line splitting through ball that cost us the first goal. And, the 2 goals at the end of the Argentina game were what they were, Australia chasing the game, but that really set it up, obviously. And even Cuba towards the end, it feels like a moment of this team was really on track together when things were all going well. And all of a sudden in the Cuba game, yes, you were 3-0 up at a point, but there were still scenarios where you had to score plenty more goals. And then for me, there was a lot of selfishness in the final third in the back half of that Cuba game. The ball could have been played around a little bit more and that could have been a 5-6-0. And potentially, we saw them act really strong in some moments in the Asian Cup, but they were under the pump in parts in this tournament. And I don't think they held up to that pressure as much as they would have wanted to.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel that when we actually look on the Asian Cup and what went right, you think about like that quarterfinal against Iraq was a game that really built their character, right? Because Iraq scored multiple times, we were still playing with the right mentality, but there was a belief that was instilled that we could win. We win it late, dramatic fashion with Battleado getting us into the lead, qualify for the World Cup there and then. But the fact that, and it's the only time, in the last real, couple cycles, maybe dating back to like the 17s from 2019 that were also a Morgan team, had, Caleb Watts bowling out, Noah Bottage having his breakout. Like, it's a really, 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 really big moment. But this team, the only time that I'd ever really seen a team take an experience like that and actually really install that as a self-belief that they can come out in a semi-final against Japan and blow that team out of the water. This is a Japan team, by the way, that's just gone 9 points from 3 games, that's into a round of 16 clash that they are likely to win. And I feel like that mentality and that side of them between the Iraq turnover into the Japan game is something that fundamentally went missing at times here. Because you mentioned even being 3-0 up against Cuba and a few of the decisions that were going wrong. And you could put it down to trivial things around, they're young and they learn these things with time. I mean, that is intrinsically still true. But it's frustrating because we saw their ability to be mentally strong. And they just never really brought that in the same way. And I think there are a lot of boys there that you can really be complacent of. I think, Daniel Benny getting really, really frustrated when there was a few balls that we picked out that could have been centered into him. And, he was really beside himself. I saw multiple moments from Torre where he's complacent. Jovanovic was not acting, in the best spirit at times. Reece Yuli, I think he was really rushing his chances a lot at the end of that game and really got, really almost like a little bit pissed off and a little bit, his head wasn't in it. And even, Stephen Hall. I mean, Stephen Hall, in the wake of his grandfather's death, saving that penalty against Saudi Arabia. But don't care that it's a youth tournament. That is one of the national team moments of all time. It just is. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And we didn't see that side of Stephen enough anywhere throughout the tournament. He rocked up to Chile, and clearly the class of opponent that was facing him, I think, rattled him a lot. Because again, the Asian Cup version of Stephen doesn't make that Cuba mistake. So it's just small things like that where they did lose their heads a lot. And I still think it's a very, very talented group of boys who can go on and do some great things in their domestic careers. Ultimately, it's done now. Maybe they can be Ollie Roos in the next couple of years, and make the LA games. That might be a bit too soon thereafter, though, surely. Anyway, my point is, I think we've still seen a very, very good team to get all this way within a World Cup, to get 3 points at a World Cup. It's still something that we should acknowledge as an achievement, but it's more the way that it's failed to become an even bigger achievement that we really ought to pay attention to here, because I think we just didn't see the best possible version of what this team could be.
Celebration without full satisfaction, right? Yeah,
well, that's it. And, I think, again, we come back to, even in times where Australian national teams haven't been at their best, I can remember in the lead up to the Russia World Cup playing Colombia or Ecuador at Craven Cottage. Danny Vukovic started in goal and saved a penalty, if I'm not mistaken. But that was a game where we obviously were warming up for the Peru game by playing a South American opponent. The game ended 0-0, and I distinctly remember, Peacock and Bozza and all those guys on the panel talking about the fact that statistically we were outclassed, but we ought to be really, really proud of the defensive resolve we've shown, because that can be the type of thing that really builds momentum into a World Cup. And the exact same thing in that World Cup game that we lost to France in 18, not 22. In 18, it was exactly the same thing. We played really well. A lot of people argue we should have drawn with France. Deschamps came out and had this famous call about this is what the Socceroos have done really, really well. And, they're one team that's going to pack a punch. This is what it's got to be like for the rest of the tournament. And I remember all that stuff going viral at the time and just thinking of the fact that there's something a little bit crazy here about the fact that we are just really, really proud of this. And it's nowhere near the ceiling that we can set for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And again, it's just that constant mentality. It all comes back to it. Australian football at its heart has a buck that kind of stops somewhere, and there's just this point where we actually just call it a day and become complacent and become proud of ourselves, and that's ultimately in the vein of this generation and their failed potential, it's knocked us out of a World Cup scenario. So